Jewish couple that I know offered to take me to their synagogue today and make me speak in Hebrew. But I was committed here. So what I did, though, is I looked at the traditional Rosh Hashanah prayers, and I used them as inspiration for today's opening and closing. Namo Amida Butsu. May we be grateful for our time together today, for this opportunity to be generous with our attention and our devotion. May we be grateful for the opportunity to remember our good deeds and those good deeds done on our behalf. And may we remember those times we have been less than loving. May we treasure each moment that our voices rise together in song, each moment that together we recall our higher purpose, each time we fulfilled our calling to serve others. We are blessed by all creation. Let our actions of body, speech, and mind benefit all beings. Well, I wasn't raised in the Jewish tradition, and I don't have a lot of experience with Rosh Hashanah, but as I understand it, this beginning of the 10-day period, the days of awe, as Rita said, then people are encouraged during this period to look inwardly, to reflect on their lives, and to repent for any bad things they've done. And I love that phrase, days of awe. And even more, I like the idea that during that period, you can change the nature of your life through self-reflection and by doing good things. And that sounds very Buddhist to me. In fact, self-reflection is one of the tools for personal transformation at work in Japanese psychology. And the other main principle is something that we might call the psychology of action, which would include doing good, purposeful deeds. So both of these processes emerged from forms of Buddhist practice that are prevalent in Japan. And as some of you know, I just finished working toward a certification in Japanese psychology. And I started this process a couple of years ago, kind of as a complement to my work as a Buddhist minister. And I thought that it might help me counsel individuals who were working through some life issues, and it does. But I also discovered that it enhances my ability to connect the teachings of the Buddha to day-to-day life, which is one of the things that I really like to do as a Buddhist minister. So there's several schools of Buddhism active in Japan, and the ones that I'm most connected with are Zen and Jodo Shinshu. And Jodo Shinshu is often shortened to Shin, so Zen and Shin, that's pretty convenient. And it happens that Japanese psychology is mainly connected with those two forms of Buddhism. Shin Buddhism is based on a concept called, the Japanese word is tariki, means other power. And this is really the recognition that you can't do much without help from others. You can't make spiritual progress solely on your own. So when you search for a way out of suffering, you look beyond yourself, searching high to that which transcends the clinging, selfish ego. Zen, on the other hand, stresses what's called jiriki in Japanese, which translates as self-power. And the idea there is that you can't make spiritual progress without making a lot of personal effort. So when you're looking for a way out of stress and suffering, your search is down to earth. You're looking down where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. So on the surface, the concept of gaining spiritual freedom through your own efforts might seem to clash a little bit with the idea of attaining enlightenment with the help of others. But if we look at how these two things work in Japanese psychology, we see that they balance one another quite a bit in practice. So I want to just tell you a little bit, before I go too far, about my experience with Japanese psychology. I got interested in this after corresponding with Greg Creech, who heads up the Todo Institute, which is one of a very small handful of places that you can train in this stuff without having to go to Japan. And we'd used one of his books in the Bright Dawn Ministry program. And not long after my ordination, I was writing him about using that book in the prison group that I meet with. But I had initially discovered Japanese psychology in the mid-'80s when I read some things by a fellow named David K. Reynolds. And Reynolds is a psychologist and writer who studied Japanese psychology in Japan and then started teaching it in the West. And I'd been to Japan, and I was interested in Japanese culture and in Japanese Buddhism. So when a book club that I belonged to offered a couple of his books as a special 1 month, I ordered them. And one of them was kind of theoretical. The other one was a practical guide with a lot of exercises in it. And I started working my way through these exercises. And some of them came out of a practice called Nikon, which some of you have worked with a little bit. And during doing those exercises, and that one especially, changed my life in some really significant ways. So Nikon arose out of Shin Buddhist practice. And the basis of Shin and the other Pure Land schools of Buddhism is that we can become enlightened by calling on Amitabha Buddha, who is sort of the mythical personification of oneness. So in Japanese, you'd say a phrase called the Nimbutsu, Namu Amida Butsu, and I've talked to you about that before. And in the 30s, there was a devout Shin Buddhist named Isshin Yoshimoto, and he did a very rigorous Shin practice called Mishirabi. There's not going to be a test on these Japanese words, so don't worry about it. Don't take it. Anyway, this particular practice involves going without food, water, and sleep for several days while you're chanting the Nimbutsu. And you keep going until you either give up or you have a spiritual awakening. Well, he tried 3 times, and on his 3rd try, Yoshimoto achieved his spiritual transformation. And he wanted to make what he had realized in his process of enlightenment available to others, but he knew that this would be way too grueling for most of us. And so he came up with Nikon. And by the way, I was just reading some stuff online about this, and there was a piece, a research article written by a Japanese psychiatrist, and he mentioned that Yoshimoto had fallen in love and had done all of this to impress the woman that he was in love with. Unfortunately, the article didn't say whether it worked out or not, but apparently she was enlightened first, and he wanted to make sure that he was worthy of her. Anyway, this word Nikon literally means looking inward. So it's a process of self-reflection, but you're not looking inward like you do when you meditate, as much as you're looking sort of deeply inward at how you relate outwardly to the rest of the world. And basically you look over your life and what's been going on, and you ask yourself 3 questions. What have I received from others? What have I given to others? And what trouble have I caused others? And the first question really is a way of working with your attention. We tend to automatically see negative things. And so this makes us look at the ways that we're supported by the world we live in. And then the rest of the questions help us see how fortunate we really are and how our actions affect other people. So you become more interested and more likely in wanting to give and in refraining from causing difficulties for others. Well, when I read Reynolds' books, my son was just a few years old, and my father, who I'd been estranged from for some time, had been writing and calling me and wanting photos of my family. And some of you have heard about my father before. I'm not going to go into detail, but he was a chronic alcohol abuser, and he was abusive in other ways as well. And I was carrying around a lot of anger toward him. I saw myself as a victim, and he was my victimizer. So I could say that I hated him. And I also used my victimhood to justify a lot of my own perceived inadequacies and some social problems. And so I avoided talking to him, and I had refused to send him any photos of his grandson. And so here I was working through this book on Japanese psychology, and I was supposed to ask those 3 questions about people in my life, starting with my mother and then moving on to my father. And I really resisted this idea that I had received anything from him. I mostly wanted to focus on a 4th question. What trouble did he cause me? But Nikon doesn't let you ask that question, which is fine, because I had a lot of practice with that one anyway. But I did the exercise anyway, and I was surprised to learn that my father hadn't really been all that evil. And not only that, I hadn't been all that innocent. I'd actually received quite a bit from him, and I had given him relatively little, and I'd caused him some pretty significant trouble. So I started taking his calls, and I sent him some photos of his grandson and some family portraits, and we had a fairly cordial relationship till he died about 12 years later. I can't say we ever became buddies. He hadn't changed. He was a violent drunk and everything else that I said he was, but that wasn't all he was. And being able to see my relationship with him through that lens of Nikon really changed a lot of the way I dealt with life. First, I was able to let go of this burden of anger that I've been carrying around. And that alone was very freeing. But I also had to let go of this crutch of victimhood that I'd been using. You know, when you can't rely on your usual excuses for the way you are, you either have to accept your flaws or you have to free yourselves from them. So, and finally, to see and to accept that my father wasn't all bad and that I wasn't all blameless, I think it made me a less judgmental person overall. I think the ability to have understanding and compassion for him made it a lot easier for me to accept my faults and the faults that I saw in others. Notice, by the way, those three questions don't ask me how I feel about anything. Nikon wasn't directly concerned with how I felt, just with what happened and what I did. And that's even more overtly the case with the Zen side of Japanese psychology. The main thread of the Zen-based therapies was established by a Japanese psychiatrist named Shoma Morita. And he was a contemporary of Freud's, but he employed methods that came from his own Zen practice in treating anxiety disorders. And his work influenced a number of Western psychologists, including the feminist psychologist Karen Horney and the father of cognitive behavior therapies, Albert Ellis. And this jiriki, or self-power aspect of Morita practice, is pretty much about what you do and is concerned relatively little about how you feel about what's going on. This doesn't mean that feelings are irrelevant. You know, a lot of people think that if you practice Zen, you shouldn't feel anything at all. There's a lot of interesting misconceptions that I encounter about Zen, and among them is the idea that you go around saying really cryptic stuff and being very serene all the time. And serenity happens with Zen practice, and I try not to be too cryptic, but I'm sure I fail sometimes. But a lot of other mental states happen as well. So one of the ideas that Morita imported from Zen was the idea that emotions, even unpleasant ones, are natural. By the way, I like there's a Buddhist psychologist, Padmasiri De Silva, who has a really nice definition of emotions. He calls an emotion the meaning that we give to our felt states of arousal. So basically there's a physical sensation or a set of sensations, and then we apply thoughts and values and things like that to these sensations. When we look at the Western model of psychology, we find we're often focusing on emotions, on how we feel about things. There's this sort of stereotypical dialogue between therapist and a patient where the therapist keeps asking, so how did that make you feel? And you're even told, if you go to a conflict management class or an active listening course, to phrase things in terms of feelings. When you spent money on a new boat instead of remodeling the bathroom, I felt, etc. So we spend a lot of time focusing on our feelings, and then we tend to either want to change the way we feel or we want to change the circumstance that we feel badly toward. For instance, a lot of people, probably the majority of people, have at least some anxiety about speaking in public. I used to be practically crippled by that anxiety. I barely scraped through an MBA program because I was so terrified of public speaking or having to make a presentation. It was a huge struggle for me. Eventually I got over it because there was important stuff that I thought I needed to say, but I was completely unable to psych myself into being calm, which is what people say you have to do. You know, the whole envision your audience naked thing and that kind of stuff. It just didn't work. I had to accept that I was going to be nervous, but that I could give a talk anyway. And once I did that, my anxiety dropped off quite a bit. And with practice and experience, I got less nervous. So Morita considered emotions, the internal experience of thoughts and sensations, to be symptoms, not problems. When we give a lot of attention to these symptoms, they tend to predominate in our awareness. So he pointed out that we can coexist with our internal experience and still take purposeful action. So rather than ask ourselves, how do I feel about this? We ask instead, what do I need to be doing? give you a personal example about how this works. So as you know, I give a lot of talks these days, and 2 or 3 a week probably, and I tend not to get too nervous about it. I get a little energized, but that's about it usually. But about a year ago, I was asked to give a prayer at the Volusia County Commission meeting at the beginning of the meeting. And I accepted, thought that would be a fine thing to do, so I showed up for the commission meeting in jacket and tie and this thing. And the county clerk called up on me to come up to the podium and say my prayer. And as soon as I stood up, my knees got wobbly, my heart started doing this, and my mouth got dry. And I thought, where did that come from? Once upon a time, I would have really freaked out about that. I would have tried to make myself calm down, which would not have worked. When you don't accept your feelings as they are, unpleasant feelings tend to increase. The Buddha had an interesting conversation once with a monk who came to him, was suffering through something. And the Buddha said, if you got shot by an arrow, would it hurt? And the monk said, well, of course. He said, well, if you got shot by 2 arrows, would it hurt twice as much? And the guy said, yes. And the Buddha said, well, why do you keep sticking yourself with all of these arrows then? And it's kind of the same thing. When you're anxious, and then you're anxious about being anxious, it makes the suffering a whole lot worse. So why not just be anxious? So this time, I just accepted that I was nervous. I didn't need to change how I felt. What I needed to do was say a prayer. So my anxiety and I got up, walked up to the podium, and said a prayer. And they invited me back. I've done this twice since then, and both times I got a little nervous, which always surprises me, but it's a little bit less each time. And no one actually knows I'm nervous except me, and now you. I don't have to feel a certain way, I just have to give prayer. So within this paradigm of accepting feelings as natural, you become cured when you take the action you need to take, not when you change the symptoms. When we take care of our lives, our feelings tend to take care of themselves. In fact, we find that behavior often influences feelings. There's this old saying that you encounter sometimes, fake it till you make it. You don't have to fake it. If you do what you need to do, regardless of how you feel, you generally end up feeling better. Feelings are only present when we're aware of them, and unpleasant emotions tend to fade naturally unless they're re-stimulated. So to try to change or fix or get rid of a feeling actually increases attention to it and typically makes it worse. And we should recognize that unpleasant emotions are the flip side of our healthy desires. The desire to do well when you give a talk or take a test or something like that is a healthy desire. The anxiety is essentially that same desire presenting in another form. So rather than change how you feel, we just develop the skills that help us to live better. So along with the self-reflection that comes from Shin Buddhism, we can work more skillfully with our attention, which is where this Zen-related mindfulness practice comes in. There's a lot of talk about mindfulness these days. I would say that the practice of mindfulness includes directing the mind carefully during meditation, and then also working skillfully with our attention in daily life. That serenity that people associate with Zen comes from acceptance, which is another skill that we need for what I call mental wellness. Not only do we do better when we accept thoughts and emotions, but when we accept reality as it is, which includes accepting that there are things that we can't control. We can't control the traffic, the weather, or natural disasters, and I discovered traffic and weather this morning. We can't control our past or the time of our death, and we might influence them, but we can't really control other people, their actions or their thoughts or their feelings. We can't really control our own thoughts and sensations. We can train and we can develop habits, but we can't just will our thoughts or feelings to be different than they are. If you don't believe me, try sitting for 5 minutes and not thinking about anything. But there is one thing that we can control. We largely have control over our actions. That doesn't mean we're always going to be able to do exactly what we want to do, but with practice and effort, we can get closer and closer to doing what serves our highest purpose. So if you're Jewish, or if you just like the idea of taking this opportunity to transform your life, you might use today to start a practice of self-reflection and doing good, purposeful deeds. For self-reflection, you could use those 3 questions to move from a life based on complaints to one based on thankfulness. For good deeds, you could use the psychology of action to go from a life directed by emotion to one directed by purpose. I think a transformation like that would certainly be worth the phrase, days of awe. Thank you for your attention. Y'all give me some interesting stuff to follow somehow. That's good, I like that though. A human life is a precious thing, more rare than the rarest jewel. Let us treasure this opportunity to live and to arrive together at this point in the year. With all our love, with all our attention, and with all our might, inviting misery and suffering no longer, we vow to accomplish the way. May all creations in the Dharma world swiftly accomplish the Buddha way together. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, guide our pursuit of profound wisdom.